Hey, what's up, everyone? Jeremy here. So this is going to break down the first steps on if you wanted to start coding and programming, and it's hopefully going to set you off in a good direction. The goal is not learning one language as best you can. You know, Python, PHP, JavaScript, whatever the language, that's not where you should be focused on. Your goal is to learn how to think like a programmer. So you're going to want to pick a language, sure, pick one off the top, Python, Java, C, doesn't really matter. Ruby, I'd recommend between Python and Ruby. Those are great, starter languages, but pick a language. Let's say, I wanted to go about Python. I would choose Python and download whatever, packages that would be needed to run Python on my system, be it Windows or Mac. So this is just going to be an overview on everything. I'm not going to get into a lot of details here. Download the requirements that you would need for your programming language or coding language, which you wouldn't need one necessarily for coding. You could use Notepad++ if you wanted, or excuse me, Notepad off Windows or whatever. But anyways, use, let's say Python, for instance. We would set it up, and then we would want to download Sublime or Notepad++, from here. So go ahead, Sublime, Notepad++, I'd recommend Sublime. And then after you have that all together, you can start either developing in here, or I'd pick an IDE actually, such as PyCharm, or that if you wanted a lightweight one, Sublime works well, but PyCharm would be the complete setup that I would highly recommend going all the way in. And I would recommend doing, just to get your feet wet with the language, as does everybody, I would recommend doing a hello world, which would be something in this language. It would look like this, and that's just showing to yourself that your setup is working, as well as kind of getting your feet wet, as I mentioned, with the language. But this should just output hello world once we save it as a py and run it. So we'll do hello.py, and I should not have saved that in there. Doesn't matter. I'll remove it here in a minute. And go ahead and build that, and then it outputs hello world. So Python is a very easy language to get started with. You don't have to do a lot of things like the extra fluff that a language typically doesn't need, or it assumes a lot of things like data types. You don't have to put semicolons at the end of statements. You don't have to do a lot of different things. A lot easier to deal with when you first started out. It helps you understand the logic of everything. The passive goal, because there's really only two goals when it comes to learning how to be a coder or a programmer. Let's focus on programmer, because coding, CSS, HTML, I'm separating those two in that aspect, or, MySQL. These are not programming languages. When you focus just on programming languages, it's going to be more relevant. Everything else, just you got to learn it, and then you get it. When it comes to programming, it gets a little bit more complicated, and I want to focus on the two main goals that there are. That's how I like to break it down. There's a passive goal, and then there's an active goal that you have to work on. The passive goal that you don't have to work on consciously, just be barely conscious of the fact that this is what the destination is, just to make sure your destination is correct, or you're putting your time at best. But when it comes to the passive goal, the whole point here is to learn to think like a programmer. Okay, all the different programming languages across the board, they all operate in a very similar structure logically. They might not include the things that I mentioned before, among a litany of other things, but that's not the point. The point is, when you learn the logic of it, loops, if statements, etc. Let's not even get into it. As I said, I'm not trying to let's keep the details out. But if you focus on how this logically works and how this talks and how to talk to it, then that's it. But don't focus on that, because that's going to be boring as hell. You don't want to worry about it. So let's focus on the active goal, which is much more productive in my opinion, which is to solve a problem. Now, a problem could be anything from an app to a game, a simple calculation, really anything, but after you do this, this is where the loop here happens. is after you do this, you created your app, your game, your calculation. You're going to want to either optimize it, add on to it, add tweaks, or you're going to want to create a more complicated project. Or it could be just as complicated, just using different parts, just learning different things while you're not consciously thinking, okay, chapter 1, let's do this. That could be beneficial when you're going through a specific thing. And then eventually, many times, often not, you'll just kind of go off on your own way and be like, okay, well, I want to do it like this because this will be kind of funner in my head, or, more exciting. But that's fine. When you actually are needing the information at that time, it seems to be much more effective in retaining that information when you are actually applying how to use that. When you run into a coding issue you don't understand, I'd recommend doing the following in this order. This will help train your mind on, looking up the documentation from that source, just because that's always going to be the most accurate. That's one of many reasons. Look up the documentation from the source, say Python, or the library from Python, or the C++ library, or the programming language itself. Whatever issue you're having, if you're needing to use a particular thing, look up that thing from that source directly. If you can't find that solution, then you can go ahead and use YouTube or forums or Stack Overflow, whatever you need. But it's always best initially to look up the documentations. We're always going to run into situations you're just not going to understand what's going on. So if I can't find how to solve it, or I just have no idea what's going on in a particular problem, you can always look up somebody that ran into that, and that's where I'd go to the community on that one. It's typically a lot faster to go to the community directly, but if you could train yourself on looking up the documentation first, that's the better way to go. Starting with a simpler syntax in a language allows you to focus on the logic, and as I was already kind of saying, but you don't have to worry about the extra padding and the stricter language requirements. As I mentioned already, Python and Ruby, specifically Python because of the community. But if you wanted to start with something lighter than programming, HTML and CSS, definitely nothing wrong with that. If you wanted to push up the medium difficulty a little bit more than Python or Ruby, that's where you're going to get into, C, JavaScript, PHP, Java. Outside of a few others, they start going up from there. I really want to emphasize that you should expect, if you're just starting coding or programming, if you do push things a little too fast, you're going to get burned out. And, when that happens, you really should just take a break. But it's a constant cycle of mitigating that, and that's just kind of how it works. Anyways, I hope that improves the mindset on what you should be concerned about when you start this field and when you're continuing it, the long-term goals and the effects and everything. If you have any questions, feel free to leave them down below. Subscribe so you don't miss any future videos, and I'll see you in the next one.